Hello and welcome to Roundtable. The European Commission has proposed a ban in the EU of products linked to forced labour and other human rights abuses. That is exactly a year after its president declared the body would take action.
Doing business around the world is good. Global trade around the world, that is good and necessary. But this can never, ever be done at the expense of people's dignity and freedom. We can never accept that they are forced to make products and that these products then end up for sale here in shops in Europe. So we will propose a ban on products on our market that have been made by forced labor, because human rights are not for sale at any price.
In theory, such a law could finally push unethically sourced goods out of the bloc's supply chains once and for all. However, some human rights activists insist the proposals don't go far enough, that they fail to protect and compensate forced labourers, while sparing the blushes of offending countries and their corporations. Will the bill become just another piece of inadequate EU legislation? Or will the Commission heed its critics and ensure the rules are fit for purpose? Very good to have you with us. I'm David Foster. The European Union's finally gearing up to act against the stain of forced labour within its borders. But the global scale of indentured work and other forms of modern-day slavery exploited by unethical companies and suppliers is immense.
We now have 27.6 million forced labourers in the world. That's an extraordinary figure in this day and age, that there are 27.6 million people compelled to work. And the even worse news is this represents an increase over our previous estimates, which were published in 2017, an increase of 2.7 million.
Under the proposals, each EU member state will be responsible for monitoring and investigating the presence of goods produced under such circumstances, and can ask for cooperation from their countries of origin. We head to the capital of the USA, Washington, D.C., and see Scott Nova, Executive Director at Worker Rights Consortium in London, Chloe Cranston, head of what's called Thematic Advocacy at Anti-Slavery International, and in Brussels, Antonio Gambini, European Lobby and Advocacy Coordinator at the European Clean Clothes Campaign Coalition. Try saying that if you're a little tongue-tied, Antonio. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming on the programme. Chloe, let me ask you first of all, I know you think this sort of thing is long overdue, but are matters without this legislation any better than they were 20, 30 years ago? Have things changed at all?
Well, unfortunately, what we actually know is that modern slavery is on the rise rather than reducing. So very recently, the International Labour Organization, which is the most important international institution around workers' rights, published its new estimates around how many people are in modern slavery around the world. And they estimated that around 50 million people are in modern slavery, and of that, around 17 million people are in situations of forced labour in the private sector, and another almost 4 million in state-imposed forced labour. And those numbers are higher than the estimates of around 5 years ago. And there's various things such as the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and armed conflict, which are leading to an unprecedented rise of the risk of people falling into forced labour, exploitation and trafficking.
OK, now I get all that, and we've mentioned some of that at the top of the programme, but I want to ask you this. In terms of what is happening within Europe, are we still turning a blind eye? Are we tougher at making sure that forced labour is not involved, or what? Where are we before this becomes law?
Unfortunately, we're at a really high risk still that the EU will and is a dumping ground for forced labour. And what we particularly see is that other countries are introducing really strong laws on forced labour, in particular the USA, which I expect my colleague here, Scott Nova, will speak about. And so as we have other countries introduce these really strong laws, what we have a risk of is that the EU, which is the world's largest single market, will become a dumping ground for forced labour goods. So compared to actually say 30 years ago, what we actually see is a very risky situation. If other countries have strong laws, companies will use the EU as a loophole to dump their products made with forced labour.
Okay, I get that. And Antonio, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Chloe, but I want to ask Antonio, is the EU therefore the international weak link here?
Unfortunately, at this point it is. With this new proposal, as soon as it will become a legislation and will enter into force, the EU will not be a weak link anymore. Now we finally have this proposal on the table. And also, of course, this is only one of the instruments to fight against forced labor. There are other instruments. And for instance, another very important instrument is the directive which is being negotiated right now on due diligence, imposing big companies the duty to have a due diligence assessment of their entire supply line. This is another tool, important tool to fight against.
Okay, we'll talk about how difficult it is to enforce any of this if and when it becomes law in just a little while. But you were name-checked earlier on, Scott, because you're in the United States, and rules and regulations there, the laws have been tighter for some time. What is it that the USA does that the EU is hoping to do?
I mean, it's important to note the U.S. has had a law prohibiting the importation of goods made with forced labor since the 1930s, but did not actually begin to enforce it meaningfully until 2015. And since 2015, we've seen an increase in meaningful enforcement of that ban. And most importantly, last year, the enactment of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, specifically targeting the massive forced labor crisis in the Uyghur region of China, which establishes a very powerful ban on the importation of any product from that region unless the brand or retailer importing it can prove that there was no forced labor used in its production.
I was going to get on to China a little bit later on, but you've already brought it up. Let's take a look at EU trade with China. And Scott, I know you're in the USA. I'll come back to you in just a moment, but I want to move this on. EU trade with China, 2011. You can see it's only about $125, $130 billion exported from the EU, imported around about 250, 260. But look at what's changed in 10 years. Pretty much doubled in terms of the imports, exports still round about half of that. Let me ask you, if I may, Chloe, about the relationship the EU will have with China. Has it been made to feel guilty about the fact that it's done nothing regards the Uyghurs and other minorities in China? And if so, by doing this, will it antagonize one of the biggest trading partners it has?
So I think we can definitely say that one of the reasons why this law is coming to the table and why the European Commission has been pushed to table this proposal is because of the Chinese government's forced labor, in particular what Scott mentioned, the forced labor of Uyghurs and other Turkic and Muslim majority peoples. So if we look at the global context that led to the European Commission announcing that it would table this proposal and led to the European Commission making that general commitment, a lot of it is related to Uyghur forced labor. In particular, the Commission was trying to push through a new investment agreement, the Comprehensive Investment Agreement with China. And that led to a lot of criticism of the Commission that they couldn't push through a trade agreement that would actually enable the Chinese government to continue with its persecution. And that's one of the things that really drove the pressure on the Commission to.
But China's not going to like this, is it?
Well, frankly, China may not like it, the Chinese government may not like it, but what's important is that forced labor products are not being traded around the world and that consumers and companies are not the beneficiaries of Uyghur forced labor. And as I said earlier as well, what we do see is other countries, so the USA, Canada, and discussions elsewhere, such as Australia, are introducing comparable laws. So
can I come to Scott on that? Because I did interrupt him to go to you, Chloe. Thank you. Was there much opposition to these laws being used, because you say they've been around for a very, very long time, but for them being enabled? And I'm wondering about what the reaction from China was.
Well, the primary opposition within the United States, of course, was from large multinational corporations, which prefer not to have these regulations in place because it leaves them free to profit from the exploitation of workers, including through forced labor, all across their global supply chain. So the main opposition politically in the U.S. was large corporations, but certainly the Chinese government opposes any effort to hold that country accountable for its human rights and labor rights abuses, and it opposes any effort to apply meaningful labor standards to trade with China, because Chinese government and Chinese corporations and their US corporate partners and European corporate partners have benefited for decades from the lack of such regulation.
So I'm wondering if, in fact, what we're looking at here is meaningful legislation or in a sense, window dressing. Is it good enough for the United States to say to China, this is something you mustn't do, and for China to say, oh, we'll stop doing it, when in fact neither side has any real intention of following through? Or is it going to change things in a big way?
It's important to understand the US law regulates the behavior of US corporations producing goods overseas and importing those goods into the US. It's not primarily between the US and China, it's between the US and US corporations exploiting workers in China. And in that sense, it is likely to be highly effective to the extent that the US undertakes a serious enforcement effort vis-a-vis those corporate importers.
And it
so
could
far,
cut down the Chinese market for goods made by these poor, unfortunate people. Cut it down because they would never reach the US consumer.
Exactly. That is exactly its purpose, to reduce the market for goods made in China with forced labor.
Antonio, I want to come to you to talk about the European perspective on this. And first, we will hear from a spokesperson for the European Commission.
The proposal covers all products, namely those produced in the European Union for domestic consumption or export, and products that are imported in the European Union, without targeting any specific industry or company. The national authorities of member states will be empowered to withdraw from the European market products which were produced using forced labor upon investigation. The proposal takes account of the special situation of small and medium-sized businesses and focuses the investigations and also enforcement on the situations where forced labor use is highly probable or likely.
Let me pick up on the first thing we heard there, Antonio. No particular country or business targeted. That leaves an awful lot of people in the clear, and companies, doesn't it?
Well, I would say the same statement in a positive way. The idea here, and it's a great idea, is to ban forced labor products wherever they may come. They may come from. And of course, there are problems in China. There are problems in other places. For instance, there have been major cases with medical gloves in Malaysia, for instance. And as the numbers we heard before, we are talking about millions and millions of people, alas, all over the world. So yes, I hope that this will help us to stop forced labor everywhere.
Well, I know what you hope, but the other thing it points out is that this is not just for the outside world, it's also within the community itself. And by not naming those EU member countries that it believes are guilty of using forced labor, isn't it doing the whole idea a disservice?
No, I think the principle is no to forced labor anywhere, and it's already a principle enshrined in all our laws, in all our human rights-centered laws, and this principle should be maintained. And we know.
But why aren't they naming the countries that they believe are guilty within their own club?
It's not about countries as such. It's about sectors, companies, practices. My organization, we work especially in the textile and the garment sector. And yes, we have seen many problematic situations, especially with the pandemic, and including cases of forced labor, for sure.
Okay, I'm going to move it to Chloe and ask you about this. Do you agree with what you've just heard there from Antonio, that there's no point in naming particular countries? And I was reflecting principally on the fact that within the European Union itself, there are supposedly guilty parties. Is it okay for the Commission to keep quiet about who they think is at fault here?
So I think the question is basically premature, actually. So forced labor does happen in the European Union. There's many examples of forced labor happening, for example, in Germany, France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands. Here where I sit in the UK, forced labor also happens. We know 130,000 people at any time are in modern slavery. Forced labor also happens in Turkey. It happens in almost every country around the world. So I actually don't think the European Commission is trying to do anything right now by not naming a specific country. Antonio's point is right. This law needs to be designed to help workers in any country, in any sector. And so it's premature now to be thinking about how they use it against forced labour, in particular European country. I think that stage will come once the law has actually been designed and used. And so we can think about then, for example, how can it help workers in a particular European country? But right now we need to be looking at it in a slightly bigger picture way.
But if you're the person being employed in an immoral way in a particular European country, and you hear somebody, the Commission, yourself, whoever it is, saying, listen, now's not the time to do it, we might just as well wait a little bit longer, see how effective this is. If you're that person, you're going to think, hang on, if they really cared, they'd do something now.
So I would say around this law in particular, it's going to be particularly powerful actually when we think about forced labour happening elsewhere outside the EU. And that goes back to Scott's point about the importance of this law to regulate what EU companies importing into the EU or companies elsewhere importing into the EU are doing, and to push them to respect workers' rights. If we're talking about what's happening right now in the EU, there are plenty of laws they should be enforcing and better enforcing. For example, around minimum wage, for example, about migration policies to ensure there's safe migration. So there's many laws already existing in the EU that are supposed to help protect workers from forced labour, and they need to be better used.
OK, Scott, let me come to you. And I'm quoting somebody from the European Commission here, but I want to ask you how this is applied in the United States. The last point she made was that small and medium-sized businesses will likely be excluded. They will not be a priority. Is that a good thing? Is that what's worked in the United States? And if that isn't what's happening in the United States, what do you make of what's been said there?
Well, it depends on definitions, but the reality is that small businesses represent a vanishingly small portion of global commerce. The vast bulk of goods imported into the U.S. are imported by large global corporations, and so that's where any meaningful regulatory effort has to start.
OK, so how is it enforced in practice in the United States?
Well, this is an important question because the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is quite sweeping in scope, and there are going to have to be a broad variety of enforcement mechanisms. But at the moment, the U.S. government is focused on identifying shipments coming into the U.S. that have content from the Uyghur region. For example, garments that contain cotton grown and harvested in Jin in that region. Once those products are identified under the law, they are automatically excluded from the U.S. until and unless the importing corporation can demonstrate by clear and convincing evidence that there was no forced labor used in the manufacture of that product. That's the core enforcement mechanism.
So they have to prove to the United States that they are actually not guilty, as opposed to the United States having to prove that they are.
Exactly, and that's entirely appropriate under the circumstances because we know forced labor is rampant in the Uyghur region. So the burden of proof appropriately has been shifted from the government to the corporations themselves. They want to bring the product into the U.S. from a region that is known to have widespread forced labor. They have to prove there was no forced labor used in making that product. If they can't, the product does not come in.
Another point that the spokesperson for the European Union made was that it was up to individual countries to police this themselves. Is that going to be effective? Because those countries that perhaps have lax labour laws themselves when it comes to forced labour in different parts of the world may well be reluctant to draw attention to what is going on. Chloe, you were nodding. I'll come back to you, Antonio, if I may, but Chloe, you were sort of nodding there as if that is an issue.
So I would say we're still looking at this closely in the European Commission proposal, and we'll be looking for some of the current ambiguities to be addressed. But what we do perceive is a potential risk that if one member state is in charge of an investigation, then that member state may not take strong enough approach. And so we need to see a coordinated approach across the European Union to make sure that no one member state can reduce the standards for others. And that will be something really important. I would just flag that there are many ambiguities and potential questions around the current proposal. In particular, we think it generally fails to put workers at its heart. So there's many improvements that need to be made to what the European Commission has currently proposed.
So you talk about the difficulty perhaps of getting those countries that could well be guilty to investigate themselves. Is there a need therefore for some kind of European manufacturing, clothing, whatever, some kind of European policeman when it comes to this?
So if I understand your question correctly, I think, overall, we would be looking for some really coordinated effort across the European Union on how this is enforced. But what I would say is it's not actually also just around how it's enforced within the European Union and how they coordinate. We also need to see the European Union coordinate, for example, with the United States, with Canada, with Mexico, which have comparable legislation. So that, say, for example, or Mexico should be introducing it. Say, for example, Canada introduces a ban on a product, that it informs the European Union, and the European Union can introduce a reciprocal ban as well, to make sure that no country which have these types of bans is allowing themselves to have a lower standard of enforcement. So it's about this type of coordinated enforcement, both within the EU, but also globally.
Okay, two things for you, Scott, if I may. If the United States is seen as, if you like, the leading light in comparison to the European Union, it's a little bit further ahead. What more needs to be done? And where has it got it right, do you think?
Well, we need to move away in the US as well as in Europe from decades of trade policy that have moved in the direction of giving global corporations free rein to profit in whatever way they find convenient at the expense of workers, at the expense of the environment. We need to move back toward meaningful regulation of the behavior of global corporations in the context of international commerce. The U.S. has done that by beginning to enforce the Tariff Act, which has made it illegal to import goods made with forced labor for going on 100 years, but wasn't meaningfully enforced until a few years ago. They've taken the important action of banning products with content from the Uyghur region of China, where forced labor is rampant. And they need to go further and more broadly to address not just forced labor, but labor rights abuses across manufacturing supply chains of all kinds. It should not be legal to import any product into the U.S. made under abusive working conditions.
Does the consumer at any stage in this actually suffer, or are they quite happy to see these changes for the benefit of those who are less well off?
I've met very few consumers who want to wear clothing or eat food or drive an automobile made under inhumane conditions that destroy the life of the person involved in its production. That's not what consumers have asked for. They don't want to save a few cents by being a party to slave labor. Consumers will be very happy to see meaningful regulation. They don't like sweatshops. They don't like forced labor. They don't like child labor. And they'll be happy to see their government stop allowing global corporations to traffic in it.
Okay, Antonio, when I talked about, if you like, a European policeman when it comes to things like this, we already have something like that, don't we? With the fair trade labels you see stuck on things, which will tell you exactly where something came from, who made it, perhaps even down to the name. Is it time to do that with every single item that is on sale in Europe now?
Yes, in order to such systems to work, the important is to have good information. At this point, typically we have little information. So yes, we ask, including in order to make this regulation work better, this proposal, to have a public mapping and disclosure of supply chains.
Okay, so you say that. Sorry, I've got to rush it on a little bit. Do apologise. Chloe, therefore, the idea as put up in my question and as answered there by Antonio is that you have, if you like, forced labour-free badges. Is that doable?
I'm afraid I'd have to maybe disagree with Antonio, however much I admire him, of course. I'm not sure about that. So as Anti-Slavery International, what we need to be clear on is pretty much, if we're talking about, our everyday products, they're made by a big company, it is very, very likely that a product is going to be made with forced labor at some point in the supply chain. It's very difficult for a company to say...
I'm going to stop you. Tell me, why is it inevitable?
Because the way that the global economy is set up is for supply chains to be extremely long, for companies to have very little responsibility deliberately over their supply chain. And so the products we use, whether that's the coffee we drink, the makeup we put on, the clothes we're wearing, the services we use, for example, the cleaners in our hotels, it's very likely that forced labor is coming around.
But make it their responsibility, otherwise they don't do business.
Well, that's exactly what we're calling for. So we're calling for a range of different laws, this one among many others. But what I would still say is having a slavery-free certification is a risk. It's a greenwashing risk. What we need to have is, instead of having these certification badges, we need to have the laws we're talking about, which hold companies accountable and mean that when they are saying they're taking steps to prevent forced labor, we can hold them accountable if they actually fail to take those steps.
Okay, quick
So
one
the
for you,
laws-
Scott. Sorry to cut you off, Chloe. Quick one for you. If, as you suggest, this is a result of globalization because we don't know where we're putting our tenders out to, who's producing what, how, where, and when, surely the last 2 years have shown us that globalization may well be coming to an end, and that this may, if you like, wither on the vine, this idea of exploitation all corners of the globe, because it just won't happen anymore.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the pandemic obviously had a significant impact on global supply chains, and there's going to be changes within those supply chains, but the general direction of corporate strategy for manufacturing has not changed. It is to move production to the place where it is the absolute cheapest to make that product, regardless of what that means for workers, regardless of the impact that has on the environment.
Thank you so much. So you see corporations, the big players, escaping blame, perhaps, or at least they think, by distancing themselves from the problem. One way to not allow them to distance themselves is to do this, keep them under scrutiny. Thank you very much indeed for coming onto the programme. Thank you, wherever you are watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, until next time, goodbye.